Cheers, happy Friday, beer runners. I am back with another edition of the iRunOnBeer Friday 5, fresh off of my finish at the Rock and Roll New Orleans half marathon last weekend. So Rock and Roll New Orleans, I believe I've said before, is easily in top probably 3 races I've ever run. This was my 4th year running the race. I absolutely love the race. I love the Rock and Roll race series, love the city of New Orleans in general, so just put the two together and I think it's definitely vying for that top spot as far as my favorite race I've ever run. So I was happy to head down there again this weekend after taking a couple years off, but definitely made some mistakes along the way, and that's what I wanted to go over is 5 mistakes that I made this weekend at Rock and Roll New Orleans that you should try to avoid during your races. I think I've gone over them before in mistakes that runners make during their races, as well as ways to avoid pre-race anxiety. I definitely did not take my own advice, but that's why I'm here, to make the mistakes, tell you about them, to hopefully save you from making those same mistakes later on down the line. But before we jump into the iRunOnBeer Friday 5, an important announcement. You may have noticed that I have my fancy new iRunOnBeer trucker hat and my new iRunOnBeer camp mug. I just updated the iRunOnBeer shop with tons of new products, so there's a link to that down below if you're interested in shopping for anything. Tons of accessories, clothes, caps, mugs, drinkware, all kinds of stuff on the website, so definitely go check that out. But without further ado, let's recap my race in New Orleans and go over some of the mistakes that I made while I was there. So just to do a quick recap of the race itself, despite the mistakes that I made, the race did go incredibly well, and I pretty much hit all of the goals that I wanted to hit. I didn't set a ton of expectations for myself. I kind of went into the race, I joked with my coach about just wanting to have a good time at the race. I just wanted to have fun. I have rarely, if ever, gone into a race without some sort of goal in mind in terms of time. I've always been pushing myself, and I was just coming off a Bandera, so I knew I didn't really have the leg strength yet to really put in like a full out half marathon race effort, but I also just have a really hard time dialing it back during races. So I went in just wanting to enjoy the race, not push myself too hard, and just have fun. New Orleans is definitely the perfect place to do that, because my other goal was, in years past I have noticed on this course, tons of people come out to cheer you on, and since New Orleans has no open container laws, there are tons of people lining the courses with free alcohol. So I also made it a goal to take advantage of any alcohol that I saw while I was out on the course, and I managed to hit that goal as well. It didn't start, I didn't see anyone until around mile 8, but I managed to have a mini cup full of Miller Lite around mile 8. I think it was around mile probably 9 or 10, I had some Truly. Then around mile 11, a woman was handing out orange slices soaked in vodka. And then at mile 13, a 1/10 of a mile from the finish line, I managed to snag a Jello shot from a man dressed as a giraffe. So as far as hitting all the alcohol stops on the course, I think I hit that goal. Had a great time at the race. I ended up finishing in just about 1:42. I think I was at 1:40, 1:59. So pretty much 1:42, but hit both of my goals. Enjoyed the free alcohol on course, and also just had a great time. I wasn't pushing myself too hard, still felt great after the race. I definitely could have run a lot harder, and it definitely gave me a lot of hope for one of my main goals this year, is to set a huge new half marathon PR. Since I haven't really raced a half marathon in a couple years, I want to see what I'm capable of, and this race definitely gave me the motivation and kind of showed me that even when I was taking it relatively easy and stopped for booze along the course, was only a couple minutes off of my current half marathon PR. So really looking forward to choosing a big goal race to knock that one off the list later on this year. Alright, so that's all the good stuff about the race. Obviously, even with the mistakes that I made, I still had a pretty great race and enjoyed myself. So luckily I didn't let the mistakes really ruin or dampen my race experience. And I guess that's the main thing that I want you to get out of this, is despite all of these things that I'm about to tell you going wrong before the race, I still kept my cool, just reminded myself I was prepared for this race. I was just there to have a good time, and didn't let it bother me too much. There was definitely some pre-race anxiety, but not nearly as much as there could have been if I let myself obsess over the little mistakes that I had made along the way. Just kind of rolled with the punches as they came and still managed to log a pretty solid race. So diving into the mistakes, number 1 will probably come as no surprise, but being that we were in New Orleans, and we were also doing like a mini college reunion with a lot of our friends from University of Tampa. We were all in town. Everyone was only in town for a couple days, and the only night we were all there to go out was Saturday night. So my wife and I told all of our friends, hey, we're running this race in the morning. We can't go too crazy. We have to be in bed at a reasonable time. And for the most part, we did a pretty good job sticking to that. Definitely drank a little bit more than we should have, but shout out to Noon Hydration. If you didn't see on my Instagram, I am one of their ambassadors for 2020, and I just stocked up on a ton of Noon electrolyte products before this race weekend. So luckily I was able to take a ton of Noon with me on the course. Probably looked like a little bit of like a creep because I had a Ziploc baggie filled with a couple Noon tablets in my pocket when we were out, and at least once or twice at each bar, depending on how long we were there, I would grab a glass of water, slip a Noon tablet into that, let it dissolve, and drink that to make sure that I was staying hydrated, although we were out having definitely a good time. So stayed out definitely a little bit later than we should have, probably only got around 6 hours of sleep the night before the race, and after a delayed flight on the Friday night, coming off of only 5 hours, was definitely feeling tired waking up on Sunday the morning of the race. So mistake number one, did not get in bed as early as I had anticipated. Definitely stayed out a little bit too late, drank a little bit too much, but did put in some precautionary measures to help avoid any detrimental effects of that. So although I was a little sluggish getting up in the morning, I was definitely able to still function and was not hungover by any means. That was the biggest thing that I wanted to avoid. I could imagine running the race tired. I could not imagine running the race being hungover, nauseous, headache, anything like that. So luckily was able to use the Noon to mitigate some of those nastier side effects of the late night out. Mistake number two also just kind of goes with the whole vibe of the trip itself, if that makes sense. But basically, my wife and I put all the plans for this trip together pretty last minute. We are notorious for booking trips and finalizing all the details pretty last minute. That was just due to a pretty crazy holiday season that bled right into the crazy season at both of our offices. And so we have just been running around a lot. It's been a lot of late nights at the office, a lot of early mornings for the last few weeks. And so we've just been a little bit frazzled. We were definitely looking forward to this trip as a way to just kind of get away and relax for the weekend. But packing for the trip was sort of last minute. We were both at work late the night before we left, just kind of throwing stuff together. Obviously went through checklists to make sure everything that we had, but didn't spend as much time as I normally do, really meticulously planning out everything that I want to take with me on a race. Luckily, I have the experience now, I think, to just kind of do that relatively habitually without having to put a lot of thought into it. I kind of know instinctively what I need, but didn't, like I said, just put a solid plan together of what I wanted. So fast forward to race morning, I had brought several different things that I thought I might need for the race, a couple different outfit options depending on the temperature, a few different layering options, etc., just to make sure I had everything I needed. But normally the night before, I'll take the flat runner picture, I'll look at the weather, I'll plan out exactly what I want to have with me on the race course, and have that laid out ready to go so that when I wake up, don't have to think about anything. My clothes are right there. I just have to suit up and be ready to go. I did not do that on this trip. I just had the clothes in the closet with the rest of my things. So just another added stressor for me in the morning was waking up, scrambling to see, okay, what's the weather going to be like? How cool is it going to be? Do I want long sleeves, short sleeves? Pulling all my gear together from the various drawers I had scattered it in. And so again, not the end of the world, but just another thing that just added a little bit to that stress level pre-race. If you watch my past video about how to avoid pre-race anxiety, the number one thing I said is anything that you can control to remove stress from the morning of, do that, and basically I just didn't do any of that for this race. So again, this was just one of those compounding stressors, was waking up scrambling, trying to remember, okay, what do I have with me? What do I want to wear today for the race? Again, not the end of the world, but just an added thing that kind of amped up that anxiety a little bit before the starting line. The next mistake that I realized I made after waking up, after putting my gear together and everything, was that we had not purchased any food for our Airbnb. Again, not the end of the world. I don't typically eat very much before I run, especially coming off of Bandera training. I did almost all of my runs in a fasted state, so I was pretty confident that I was going to be all right. I had some gels just to get some energy, some calories in me, as well as the snacks that Rock and Roll provided in the gear bags that you got at check-in. But waking up, my go-to is usually at least like half an English muffin with peanut butter or toast with peanut butter, something like that. Just like I said, to get something in my stomach, get a little bit of energy. And as I was making coffee in the morning, just realized that we did not have any food or anything to eat except what Rock and Roll had provided. So although I was a little bit nervous to put something I hadn't tried before into my system immediately before a race, I figured something was better than nothing, so I did decide to have, they had like a little bit of a fruit bar, which I figured was a pretty safe bet. But just another thing that I realized, again, since we didn't put as much forethought into prepping for this race as we normally do, waking up realizing, well, crap, yes, I can make it through this race without food, but I definitely would have preferred to have a little bit of some kind of snack in my system. So just another thing, again, you're just going to see these little things that we missed along the way that just add a little bit of stress, a little bit of stress, a little bit of stress over time. None of them were deal breakers, but just added things that are just adding to that anxiety getting ready before we headed to the starting line of the race. Mistake number 4 was by far the most anxiety inducing, the most stressful, and I think the biggest mistake that I made all weekend, and that was when I woke up the morning, Sunday morning for the race. Again, groggy from the late night, the night before, went to go make the coffee. All of a sudden I am stricken by this realization: I did not put together a playlist for the race. Again, might not seem like a huge idea, but I think anyone who listens to music when they run will understand how detrimental this was, or how nerve-wracking this realization was. Trying to remember, oh my God, what am I going to put together? We now only have probably 30-ish minutes to get ready to head to the starting line, and I have to put together at least an hour, 45 of music in a playlist to get me through this run, having no idea what I want to listen to. So definitely a very stressful realization. I have a few go-to songs that I always listen to, but you may have seen a past episode of the Friday 5 where I kind of go through the anatomy of my race playlist. I have a very specific sort of trajectory of genre of music that I listen to, or how I want my mood to go throughout a race. I try to coordinate the music that I'm listening to with the mood that I want to be feeling while I'm running. So starting off kind of softer, just easy, getting into sort of flow state at the beginning of the race, then sort of building to that more angry, aggressive rock, hip-hop kind of music. A lot of Eminem at the towards the finish line, just to get me through that final push when I really need to dig deep. So unfortunately, hadn't put any of that planning into the race playlist for this race. Hadn't even started putting ideas together of what I wanted to listen to. So spent a lot of the morning just going through what I'm listening to recently, things that have come up on my playlist on Spotify. Luckily, I have a lot of different playlists organized on Spotify that I could kind of pull from, but had no idea what I was going to want to listen to on the race, or how the artists that I chose were going to work out. Luckily, there are 2 albums in particular that I've pretty much been listening to constantly, so I filled a lot of the playlist with just that music. The Glorious Sons, if you haven't listened to them, I actually just saw them in concert. They are phenomenal, an excellent rock and roll. A lot of, they kind of go back and forth between those easy, cooler, softer songs to more of that like angrier, not even angrier, just a little bit louder, more amped up rock music. So I knew they were going to be a solid choice. And then obviously I'm a huge fan of Eminem, so had a lot of his new album on there as well. So I was able to fill a lot of the playlist with that, but I think after I put all the songs from both of those albums that I wanted, I was still only at like 45 minutes. So it was stressful, it was challenging. I think, like I said, easily the biggest mistake that I made going into the weekend was not putting any forethought into the playlist that I wanted to put together for the race. But again, didn't let it get to me. I wasn't pushing myself too hard for this race, so I knew that as long as I had music that I enjoyed that would sort of distract me, I could still coast through the playlist. So put together what I could, managed to assemble what I think was a pretty solid playlist, and definitely got me through the race in the way that I needed. And mistake number 5, the final mistake that I will go over, but definitely not the final mistake that I made over the weekend. But again, probably one of the most important ones. I think this is the number one thing I said to avoid on race day when I did my video on mistakes that runners make and ways to avoid pre-race anxiety. And that is arriving to the starting line late. Not late as far as like arriving there after the race is supposed to start, but arriving there with not really enough time to do all of the things that you want to do to calm down and warm up before a race. And so this just had to do with, we've run the race before, so I didn't look into the organization of the starting line as much as we normally do. We figured we would just figure it out once we got there. We were within walking distance, so we took for granted how close we were, and didn't really estimate correctly how long it was going to take to walk from the hotel to the starting lines. Again, just a lot of little things that compounded into a more stressful mistake. But by the time we got to the finish line, we had to hustle over to gear check. They were packing up the vans when we got there, so if you've never done a rock and roll race before, what they do is they have it organized by last name so that when you finish, it's very easy to find your bus, all the gears organized alphabetically. Super simple process. Unless you get there after most of the vans have already closed up and are about to leave. Then they leave the final bus, I think it was Q to Z, or UPS truck, and everyone's bags who are late to the starting line just get tossed in there, not organized at all. And then when they get to the finish line, they attempt to organize them by bib number, so it's a little bit easier. But there was definitely panic when my wife and I walked up to the finish line. That did not help with my stress level pre-race, but it was just a lot of people who were in the same boat as we were, trying to figure out where they were supposed to go, everyone running around. When we got to the gear check, I mean, again, I was trying to roll with the punches, wasn't too panicked, so I just kindly walked over, handed the bag to the lovely volunteer who was taking the bags and organizing them on the shelves in the truck. Unfortunately, most runners were not as polite, and I think let the stress get to them, so they were just throwing bags past him, past the volunteer, throwing them into the truck and trying to run to the starting line. So a little bit of mayhem, a little bit of chaos that easily could have been avoided if I had arrived there even 10-15 minutes before then. And so that's one thing that I want to stress is just make sure that you get to the finish or the starting line with enough time to do anything that you need to do while you are there. After we dropped off the bag, didn't even really have time for a warm-up, was able to do some dynamic stretching and things like that just to loosen up, but I do really love to do a warm-up mile before a race, wasn't able to do that, so I just started the race a little bit slower to give my legs time to warm up, but just went through my dynamic stretching warm-up routine and hoped that that would suffice. And it certainly did, but again, I always err on the side of caution and would love to have been able to do a full warm-up to make sure that I was good, loose, ready to go before the race. Again, this did not make or break the race, but that was sort of the final nail in the stress coffin, just in terms of I was already a little bit anxious, I was panicked, did I pack all the right things, did I have the right fuel with me, did I put on enough body glide, did the clothes, were the clothes that I picked gonna suit me for the race. I was worried about blisters on my feet, I was worried about a lot of things, and then just not having the time at the starting line to kind of zone in and prepare myself mentally for the race, just allowed that anxiety to continue to build. So that was definitely by far, I think, the worst mistake that we made of the weekend, and the one that I would say absolutely do everything that you can to avoid for race day, because it makes your life so much easier if you can just arrive at a starting line with enough time to settle in and mentally prepare for the race, which we did not leave ourselves enough time to do. So there you have it. Even an experienced runner such as myself still makes mistakes, but I make these mistakes so that I can learn from them and tell you about them so that you don't have to. So those were the 5 main mistakes that I made this weekend leading up to the rock and roll race. But as I said in the beginning, my top recommendation is even when things go wrong, because believe me, no matter how much prep you put into all of your races, there are going to be races where things go wrong, and if you're like me, there are going to be races where almost everything goes wrong. And you just have to lean into the experience that you've had from your past, remind yourself how much work you've put into this race, and just do everything you can to settle yourself mentally. Don't let the anxiety get the best of you. Don't obsess over the little things that go wrong. Control the controllables and just focus on on what you can do to help alleviate those stressors as they come up. It would have been very easy for me to panic at every step of the way getting ready for this race this Sunday morning, and I certainly did. I mean, don't get me wrong, I definitely panicked a little bit at certain spots. The race playlist was definitely one of the biggest ones, but you just have to kind of, as you start to feel yourself panic, remind yourself, again, you're ready for this, you've put in the work. Just because not everything went exactly according to plan isn't going to ruin your race. You're still in control of the event, and so it just helps to stop, breathe, and remind yourself it's not going to be the end of the world. You can still have a good race. Again, focus on the things that you can control to give yourself that power back so you don't feel helpless from some of these anxiety-inducing experiences that might come up. And I think this is the perfect example. Despite all of these things going wrong, I still ran a 1:42 half marathon, and I was drinking alcohol along the way. So the fact that my previous PR before this race back from Philly 2018 was a 1:38, and I was only 4 minutes off of that PR, that gives me a ton of hope for the race that I'm hopefully going to complete later this year. I'm still looking for that ideal half marathon. I think that's my #1 goal for 2020 is I really just want to smash that half marathon PR and use Rock and Roll New Orleans as sort of a trial run, just to sort of gear where I was at fitness-wise going into a half marathon, how I could do just taking a race relatively easily to get an idea of what I might be able to push myself to do later on this year. So again, top recommendation if you ever find yourself in a similar situation, just relax, just breathe, remember to have fun. That's why we do this, because we enjoy the sport of running, and I still got my medal, still had a phenomenal race, and we'll definitely be back in New Orleans in the future to run it again. Easily one of my favorite races I've ever run, and can't wait to get back to New Orleans. So I hope all of your training for whatever races you're doing is going well. I hope you're putting in the planning that I did not, but even if things go wrong, I know you're going to do great. So thanks for tuning in for another episode of the Friday 5. Congratulations on making it through another week, and we'll see you next week. Cheers.